And we're live. Well, good morning, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another CICW book talk. My name is Ermin Sinanovic. I'm the executive director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University. And I welcome you all and thank you all for joining us in what should be another wonderful conversation with, today we have Professor Emily Greble from Vanderbilt University. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. So the book we're discussing, and I always like to show it so that people see that it is a real book, is Muslims in the Making of Modern Europe. It was published by Oxford University Press. It came out a while ago, not too long ago, but received a lot of critical acclaim, covering the part of the world and issues that are not often considered when people talk about Islam in Europe and Muslims in Europe. And so for that, we are grateful to Professor Greble for writing this book. Just very briefly, Professor Emily Greble is Associate Professor of History and Russian and East European Studies at Vanderbilt University. Before this book, she wrote another book. It's called Sarajevo, 1941-1945, Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Hitler's Europe. So obviously that book was about Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina during the World War II and during the Nazi occupation. So this, in a way, is sort of continuation of that same conversation, I would say. And Professor Greble has really carved out the wonderful niche within Southeast European studies and European studies, talking about Islam in Europe and highlighting especially the legacy of Islam in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the rich history of Muslims in the Balkans and Southeastern Europe in general. Like I said, the introduction is going to be brief. You can read in the chat function on YouTube. I have posted a link to the book where you can get a longer description of the book, as well as Professor Greble's bio, where you can learn more about her own work. So, Emily, I'm going to start, and I hope you don't mind calling you Emily.
Oh, absolutely, it's fine.
I'm going to start with a question that I always ask as a first question of the author, and that is, why did you write this book? How does it fit into your larger body of work? And if you could briefly tell us, what is the main argument of this book?
Yeah, so I wrote this book in part because I realized that we being historians, but also the general public, didn't really have a full understanding of how Muslim communities existed and were part of the foundational moments of modern European states. And by modern, I mean sort of the center, the states that emerge after the French Revolution. This idea came to me. I was in the archives in Novi Pazar, which is a small city in southern Serbia. And I came across a set of legal documents from the late 1940s, in the period that we often think of as this early socialist period, communist Yugoslavia, Tito's Yugoslavia. And in these court cases, socialist judges were making rulings according to Sharia law. And this was really mind-boggling to me. I mean, I had spent at that point, 15 years reading documents and studying the region and reading books. And I didn't realize how pervasive this idea was that Muslims would be guided and governed according to Sharia law. And I started to want to understand sort of what that meant. What did it mean for the states? What did it mean for the communities? And I started to peel back in time to make sense of sort of where we got to and how that came to be. And as I did, I realized that Muslims had been part of a lot of states at the essential moments when these states were founded. They were part of conversations about how the economies and laws would be structured, about the ways that nation building would happen. This includes the Habsburg Empire. It includes Greece. It also includes Serbia and Montenegro and eventually the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania. I mean, there were all these states. And yet that part of the narrative was, I think, missing from a lot of the ways, at least in the English historiography, we were talking about these states and these nation buildings. And so I went back and I kept going back in time and traveling to lots of different archives across the region in what is today Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and tried to start to piece together part of this story. And it's not the full story, and I look forward to other historians dealing with other parts of it. But the main arguments of the book, I would say, are sort of threefold. The first is that Muslims are Europeans, and they are part of European history, and they have shaped the evolution of European citizenship, European law and legal jurisprudence, European economies, European state structures, and we need to start with that. That's our starting point. The second part of that is that they've often been erased from a lot of history. Muslims are tended to be treated as others, as foreign, as migrants, as refugees, whether we're talking about Southeastern Europe or we're talking about contemporary Britain and Germany. There's this sense that Muslims are somehow not central to the European historical experience. And this is false. And so what the book tries to do is, in one part of a region where I work with and speak the languages, recreate how and why that is false, and develop arguments and show sort of at the really local level how Muslims were central to the evolution of sort of the ways both the European political order was developing and also individual states and societies were developing.
Thank you so much. That really sets the stage nicely for the rest of our conversation. And I would like once again to welcome our audience on YouTube who are joining us live. Please note that you have chat function on YouTube, and feel free to submit your comments and questions for Professor Greble there, as well as any kind of comment that you would like to make about the book or the larger theme that we are discussing here. Now that we have sort of basic overview, basic argument of the book, I would like you to talk a little bit about the Congress of Berlin. 1878 is the year, especially for Bosnia, that is so important. For the Balkans people, I think the Congress of Berlin does not need too much introduction, but I think for the larger audience often does not have a full view of how instrumental that agreement was to set the rest of the history that came after that event. So tell us a bit about it, and what is its importance, especially for the Muslims of Southeastern Europe and the Balkans in particular.
Absolutely. So there are a number of different wars that were going on between the Ottoman Empire, within Ottoman lands, and between the Ottoman Empire and Russia. And in 1878, a variety of foreign diplomats convened in Berlin to sort of end the war and also redraw the political boundaries of Southeastern Europe, or Ottoman Europe. So they took Ottoman lands, some of which had various autonomous statuses that might have mirrored independence, but were technically still part of the Ottoman Empire, and other lands that were core parts of the Ottoman Empire, and they redrew the boundaries. And in that moment, we see sort of independent Serbia or Serbia's independence being acknowledged at the international level, Montenegro. We also see the Habsburg occupation of Ottoman Bosnia. And we have a sort of reconstitution of boundaries. And I have a number of maps in the book that sort of show all the ways that these lines get drawn and redrawn. Within that process, the statesmen who are sort of leading the Congress of Berlin insist that all states that claim Ottoman territory give all men equal sort of religious and civil rights. And what this means is that Muslim men in places like Austria-Hungary, in Bosnia, but also in Serbia and Montenegro, at least on paper, they receive full citizenship rights. And so I use this as a starting point of the book because it's really the first time in European history where the concept of citizenship is sort of deployed to all confessional groups. The one state that won't do it is Romania, and there's some really great work by a historian, Catalina Hunt, who deals with some of this. Now, of course, how it all works out is part of what the book deals with. I mean, citizenship is many Muslims didn't want citizenship. They didn't want to be a citizen of Montenegro. They wanted to remain, part of an Ottoman subject. And so, I deal with some of that tension, but from the point of sort of the way a state is understanding itself and the laws that come after, this is a really critical moment. And and Muslims are getting citizenship in a place like Serbia before they're getting citizenship in a place like France. And that's another point that I like to point out here, because I think it's really important that, in France, a Muslim in most parts of France couldn't be a full citizen unless they renounced Islam. And that was until 1946. And that just was not the case in Southeastern Europe. And so you have this sort of really interesting experiment about how law and rights are going to work out. And then the book tries to deal with places where that works out well and other places where it doesn't.
Yeah, and so after the Congress of Berlin, then we have all of these nation building processes. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could unpack this a little bit for us. Tell us a bit about these nation building processes after the Berlin Congress, and how did what you call in your book confessional sovereignty emerge? Obviously explaining to us what it means, and then how did it emerge, why is it so important?
Mm-hmm. So this is where you have this sort of complex paradox that emerges in the late 19th century, and it's something that we see through the 20th century. On the one hand, Muslims are considered equal citizens, which means they have the same rights as Christians. And again, this is initially just men, but also the same obligations. So part of nation building requires sending your children to school. They have public school systems, requires serving in the army, requires paying taxes to the state. Within the Congress of Berlin and within the early constitutions and laws of these states that emerge out of the Ottoman Empire, there's also what I call confessional sovereignty, which is that religious communities, particularly Muslims, have the right to sort of self-govern. And they are going to be allowed to maintain authority over their religious education, over their funds, which are predominantly through the waqf or vakuf, as we say in South Slavic languages. And so there's this tension in that, what does it mean to have religious freedom and authority over your community, your religious community, and the right to define what Islam is going to be and what that's going to look like? And they continue to have a Sharia judicial system that all Muslims sort of are part of, and yet also be required to be part of these nation building projects. And so we see a number of tensions. For example, I'll give one in terms of schools. Right. So if you look at the school curriculum in a place like Montenegro, the school curriculum, the Montenegrin nation had a sort of Christian foundational root. And so a lot of sort of holidays and national history and civics was grounded in both a Christian and sort of nationalist, anti-Ottoman, anti-Islamic curriculum. And so Muslim leaders would come and say, okay, well, we're required to send our kids to school, but we also have the right to define the religious component of our education. And we don't agree to that. Like, we're not, and so we end up with these clashes where different government leaders and local Muslim leaders are sort of trying to work things out and figure out, what does this look like then for the Muslim child, right? And can a Muslim child be proselytized? And if not, what kind of recourse do Muslim leaders have to protect the child, but also within the rights they've been given by the laws of the countries in which they live?
Yeah, so actually, usually my way of doing this is that we go through certain questions that I have for you, and then we answer those, and we switch to the questions that we have from the audience. But actually, we have a question or comments that are very relevant to the exact thing we're talking about right now. So
yeah, I would love to
bring that in. So
that's
to make
great.
it a little bit more interactive.
Audience participation is always a positive.
So we have a reptilian lord, and I would wish that if people could identify themselves, I think would be easier and better. But the argument, the question or the comments are here. I have bought and read the book, and while it is excellent, I'm skeptical of the mission to argue for native Muslim agency and inclusion into secular citizenship and the modern state. While Halak has critiqued this position of native agency and the modern state and its citizenship, the book itself shows that the Balkan Muslims did not seek to be defined as citizens. Foucault has shown that the state is not benevolent, and Dr. Greble shows that the aggressive surveillance and disciplining of Balkan Muslims in the book. And then finally, it says confessional sovereignty had to go through the state, and the state never ceased surveilling and attacking Muslim institutions, as the book clearly shows.
Right.
So it's more of a series of comments, and I would like you maybe to address this in a couple of minutes, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that reptilian is spot on, right? That part of what the book argues is that citizenship is not a feel-good, multicultural experiment, but can be incredibly violent. And what I'm trying to show is that there are places where even while sort of forced within this system, that Muslims are not solely passive agents, that a lot of the historiography we have it focuses exclusively on victimhood, and there is a lot of victimhood. I mean, there are, as every boundary changes, as new states come through each war that we see in the late 19th and into the 20th century, in the Balkan Wars and World War I, and again in World War II, I mean, we have mass violence, we have armies coming in, razing Muslim villages, we have cases of mass expulsion. I mean, this is a very violent process. And Balkan history often focuses exclusively on the violent processes. What I'd like to, what I'm trying to show here is that and I deal with the violence in the book, but that, there's violence is one part of a much larger complex story. And I think trying to center Muslim experiences, not always as agents, but also just sort of centering the experience of how a Muslim understands citizenship. And I open one of the chapters with this, right? He doesn't want to be the Abdullah in Podgorica. He doesn't want to be a citizen, right? He gets thrown in jail. He doesn't want to pay taxes to the state. He doesn't want to serve in the army. He doesn't want to, the boundaries were redrawn without his consent. And so at different points of the book, I talk a little bit about what this means when you've got indigenous local communities who are absorbed by states that they don't consent to, and then those states are giving them rights that they don't necessarily want. And I mean, we even can see the same thing, and I know we'll get into the socialist period, but the communists come in and say, great, you're going to have all of these rights, and these rights that are given don't always feel like rights. They're called rights, and we talk about them as emancipation or rights, but that concept is really complicated for people who don't consent. And I think the places where we find the most negotiation and compromise, where Muslim leaders are actually brought in to talk about what are we doing here, we see in those moments the most agency. And one example I can give is after World War I, in certain small towns, they create these little committees. And this is based on an Ottoman model. A lot of what's going on, a lot of the experiments that are happening are drawing directly upon previous Ottoman models that worked well. And they have these multi-confessional city committees that are deciding things like curfews, or who gets to move into a town, or how do we distribute food. And in those places, I think we see kind of the most resolution, but it's not at the state level. And as the comment said, the states continue, and this becomes even more pervasive through the 1920s and 30s. The states use these separate Islamic institutions as a means of surveying and monitoring, and actually trying to sort of shape Islam in their own image, which I should say is also something that we see in the French Empire and the British Empire and the Russian Empire. So this is a common, until today, it's a common European tactic to kind of control and survey Muslim lives, Muslim bodies, Muslim laws.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for addressing that. We had another comment basically asking where can we buy the book, and I think the person is asking from Serbia, at least that's what the comment said, and I gave the Amazon link because I assumed that Amazon would be available there. I don't know if it's locally available. And I'm not sure if this has been translated into local languages, Bosnian, Serbian, Albanian, or...
Not yet. It's going to come out in the Bosnian translation is just starting in the works. I actually, for the person in Serbia, I gave a book talk in Serbian about a month ago at the city library of Belgrade, and I gifted a copy of the book to the library. And there's also a copy of the book at the Institut za savremenu istoriju in Belgrade. They also have a copy in their library. So, I've been trying to go to different countries as I can and donate books to institutions, archives, and libraries where I worked and that have supported me, at least so people can get their hands on it. Because I know it's complicated to order things, and especially with this COVID stuff, all the supply chains. I mailed books to Montenegro and they just never arrived. So I'm going to Montenegro next week to bring.
You are? Okay, good. Well, thank you for doing all that, and especially I think for students, even if they have an opportunity to buy a book, let's say on Amazon, it's not I think for student standard in the Balkans, it's not that cheap or that accessible. So any library that would have the book definitely helps for especially students to be able to get the book and check it out. So let's continue our conversation, sort of say chronologically. So then we have the Balkan Wars and the World War I, and these are really, tectonic events. They change a lot of things in the Balkans in general. There are new nations emerging. And so could you tell us, please, a bit about how does all this impact the Muslims of the region?
Yeah, so the Balkan Wars and World War I are incredibly tumultuous, violent. There's a lot of refugees that, people who are displaced. And of course, that's not just Muslims, Christians and Jews across the region. It's this moment of mass trauma. It's also from sort of a status of or position of kind of how international law and relations are changing. The place of the Ottoman Empire shifts through the Balkan Wars and World War I, and the relationship that the Ottomans have with local Muslim communities changes. Prior to the Balkan Wars, a lot of the kind of rights to confessional sovereignty that I talk about in the late 19th century are technically protected through treaties that countries have signed with the Ottomans. And so, for example, and there's Leyla Amzi Erdoglar, who writes about this in her work, Muslims who disliked a certain kind of, a certain ruler who were seeing kind of their state as not following the guidelines of what they understood could petition to the Ottomans. And the Ottomans could then use their power, diplomatically to try to put pressure on local governments or state governments to abide by these rights. But that kind of comes to an end, especially in World War I, where different countries are at war and the treaties change. So, for example, we have this case in Serbia that I talk about, was one of my favorite documents to find, of these Muslim families whose daughters have been kidnapped by men and taken over a border. And they go to the Serbian government and they say, okay, can you go find our daughters and bring them home? Well, then there's this question of, well, did the daughters elope? Did they get married? Marriage is not, marriage should then fall into the Sharia courts. Then we can't touch that. And without the Ottomans sort of coming in or making any statements, it's all based on local negotiation. And then ultimately the Serbian government says, we don't know really what we can do. We defer to the local courts. Well, the courts have all collapsed because it's a war. So then they say, well, we'll defer to the elders. So then you have this case where these women actually have no legal protection at all because there's no jurisprudence, no system. And I like this example because it reminds us that, the wartime moment is not just about expulsion and refuge, but that this has real implications for individual families. And, for these parents who can't find their daughters, they're trying to deal with this complicated, shifting local legal system, international legal system, and how this all works. The other thing we have in especially World War I is certain Muslim leaders who felt marginalized and repressed by previous governments start to make alliances, and they will align in different ways against the states where they had citizenship. And this becomes a huge political issue as the war comes to an end, especially in a place like Serbia, where certain members of the Muslim elite aligned with Austria-Hungary, right? Not knowing, where the war was going, and then Serbia comes in at the end, and so you end up with this kind of tense political negotiating that then will affect the ways that these communities are treated in the post-war period.
Yeah. So, during this period, and you already hinted at this, but I want you now to tell us a little bit more about it.
I think you've frozen, Armin. I'm not sure if I'm frozen also. But you are frozen on my end. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the YouTube station to see if we are also frozen for the audience, or you guys are just looking at one of us. Let me call Armin, because I have his number, and let him know that he is frozen on my end. Thank you to the audience for bearing with us. Oh, I am now the host, and he is totally gone. I'm going to go to the YouTube link that he emailed me and see if I can at least answer some questions that you guys have, because I know your time is precious and you've joined us. This, what I like to think of as a post-pandemic era, but one never knows where we're at. Okay, let's see, live chat. Great, so I'm seeing Reptilian Lord is the last question that I see. Confirming, he froze. Thank you, Ismail Jali. Well, if anyone has any questions other than Armin, I'm happy to continue to use this time until he comes back for us. I can also talk a little bit more about the book itself. What a strange moment. This is my first moment of not having an interviewer in a live stream. So one of the other questions that Armin had sent to me and told me he wanted to discuss a little bit was what happens in World War II. And I know he was moving chronologically here, but I'm going to just talk a little bit about the end of the war. So one of the things that becomes really interesting to me as the book moves through, so we kind of go from the Balkan Wars into the interwar period, where I focus especially on the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which becomes Yugoslavia. And then I go into World War II, and I deal with sort of all the complexities of how the Muslim alliances, Muslim experiences, both as victims and also as perpetrators, and also this tension between what it means to be a Muslim in the middle of a kind of complex, multi-sided ideological war in which no side is actually sort of on the side of Muslims. Oh, you're back. I tried to keep us going.
Thank you so much for doing that. Believe it or not, there was a power outage here at the hotel, so we lost everything. It's
yeah, this happened to me once. I was teaching a class with Jamil Aydin at UNC, and UNC lost their power. So only the students who were available on Zoom, who were not on campus, were still there. I think you might be frozen again.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I hear you now. Yes.
All right. So yeah, I switched to my phone, actually, hotspotting, but I'm not sure that we are back live on YouTube.
I'm seeing that we're live. Maybe Ismail Zali, if you might be able to tell us if we are. I just was monitoring the chat. Are we live? No comment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if we're actually back on YouTube or not.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure that out as well. This has never happened, but it's one of those things that,
It's one of those
yeah,
things.
yeah. Uh, I think what I could do is I could stop live stream and try to restart it, but I don't know if people had left already. So, well, let's see if that works. But now you can see me and hear me fine, right? All right, then let us continue. So I lost you for a couple of minutes. I didn't have, you were talking about,
I was just giving an overview of where the book goes after the Balkan Wars, and I had just mentioned we were at World War,
Mhm.
the interwar period, and then the Second World War, and I was about to get to the communist period. I just thought I would give the bigger overview, but we can go back to your questions.
Yeah, so my question was, during that period, there were a lot of intra-Muslim debates within the Muslim community on the nature of citizenship, Sharia, and many other things. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the 1920s are this really kind of chaotic and amazing time across the Islamic world, both in Europe and the Middle East and also South Asia. Where, especially after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the abolition of the caliphate, there are a lot of questions over sort of where's this going and what role does Islam play in state building, in politics, in mass movements. For Muslims in Southeastern Europe, where there were these questions over what it means to be a Muslim as a minority and what it means to sort of be a Muslim as part of a global community. And there were debates over over specific aspects of state and society and culture, and also debates over how to formulate a distinct kind of Muslim political identity in this situation. Now, in 1921, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes does something kind of remarkable among European states, which is that it enshrines Sharia in its first constitution. It means that all Muslims living in the state have the right, but also the obligation to follow Sharia law according to, and to abide by Sharia according to in family matters, so marriage, divorce, custody, and inheritance questions. But exactly what that's going to encompass becomes a question of debate, especially in questions around property and sort of the waqf and how it will fit into the system. Now, what becomes sort of fascinating here is that Muslims, the Sharia courts that are enshrined in the Constitution are state subsidized and state structured. So the courts are state funded. So the courts become one of these places where Muslims both have sort of agency and control over how to define sort of what Muslim practice will be and life will be and their relationships with the state, but also becomes a place for the state to intervene and try to shape and change and supervise Muslim practices. This leads to a lot of different kinds of internal debates, especially within the Islamic legal community, over how to best utilize sort of the laws and legal structures of Islam in order to kind of protect the boundaries of the religious community. And so we end up with certain groups of reformists who are looking toward, some of whom are looking toward Kemalism, some of whom are looking toward Egyptian legal revivalism, and trying to think about sort of what is the best path forward for a Muslim minority in a European state, and how can they use these legal structures to protect what they see as the best path forward. And so the book really tries it. This is, in some ways, some of my favorite parts, because and in some ways, perhaps the parts that people's eyes will glaze over, because does get really into the local law and how these legal questions, where we find the division. So, for example, over a bank, right? At what point is a bank? Is that haram? Is it something that can be understood as protecting the community as a minority within a state? Same thing with questions of there's all sorts of debates over the women and wearing, the headscarf or the veil and sort of what, and we see these kinds of debates in all over the world over, what it means to formulate a Muslim modern political identity and how that's going to relate to the larger society, especially for Muslim minorities.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. And just a reminder to our audience, and I really am grateful that you're sticking with us, that maybe 5 minutes ago, I lost power in the hotel room from where I'm conducting this book talk. And for a minute or two, I think I was off, but I'm grateful to Professor Greble for, very professionally continuing the conversation while I was away. When you're long enough in this business, anything happens and you have to be prepared for it. So I thank you, Emily, for that and for keeping the conversation going. I assume that now you all can hear us and see us. So before we go back to one of my questions, we have a couple of questions from the audience, and I like to bring those in since they've been so patient with us, and they they sort of stayed with us through all the trouble that the technology can give us. So one question is by Ismail Ali. Did other religious or ethnic minority communities stand out for their relationships with the Muslim groups you covered?
Yes, this is a great question, and it's something that I get asked a lot, and I think the answer is it really depends where and when we're talking about. So in certain parts of the region, for example, in the 1930s and in the early 1940s, there were real movements along the right of the Croatian national movement, which eventually becomes the Ustaša takes over in World War II. But even before that, there's sort of the Croatian Peasant Party and other sort of national Croatian movements that really try to pitch Croatian identity as sort of both Catholic and Muslim. And so you end up with sort of all sorts of local political and cultural alliances in that way. In other moments, we see sort of Muslim Orthodox identity, in places where you've got, the mufti in Bar and the patriarch in Montenegro, or you've got different kinds of people sitting down and working together. What I find is that we don't see this idea of being a minority as something like we don't see a lot of cases, for example, of Muslims and Jews identifying both as minorities and therefore coming together as like, we're now the minorities. That kind of language historically didn't exist in the same way that it exists now. What we see more of is each group trying to kind of figure out its own relationship to the state and sort of larger majority society. Muslims do use the language of minority and they try to claim, and there's a great piece by Fikret Karcic that talks a little bit about this, all the ways that they Muslims are trying to, through resolutions, sort of claiming minorityness and using that to stake out rights and recognizing that this concept of minority is one that Europe is sort of introducing and using as a political term. And so how then do you kind of create a cultural and political unit that fits with that term? But for the most part, I would really say it's very local and regional and dependent on where you are and when.
Thank you. And the other question is, Dr. Greble, what are your thoughts on Fabio Giomi's book, Making Muslim Women European, in case you're familiar with this book?
So I think Fabio's work is terrific. We're going to be on a panel next November together in Chicago talking about sort of writing Muslims back into European history and how one does that. I think where Fabio and I sort of would diverge is if you just think about the titles of our two projects, right? So Making Muslim Women European has a different presumption than I would start with. I begin with the presumption that these Muslim women are European. And if we're not seeing them as European, then that's about the way we're defining Europe. You are a European whether you wear a hijab or high heels. You are a European whether you are married to a Muslim or married to a Christian, or whether you're secular or religious. I see all of these Muslim women as European, regardless of the choices that they make. I also see Islamic legal revivalism as a European mass movement. I don't see this as foreign and other. I think we have a lot of movements that emerge in the 1920s and 1930s that are sort of on different kinds of fringes, trying to make sense of what the European political project is and how to redefine it. And I see Islamic and Islamists in Europe as part of that process. And I don't understand why we've written them out. We might not, one might have opinions about whether, a certain political movement fits with their own ideas of what is Europe, but that doesn't make it any less European. It's happening in a European political space, and Europeans are participating. And so I think that just to come back to the original question, right? If we think about the idea of, what it means to be modern, I think I take a more capacious view, but I look forward to actually talking to Fabio about this, because I think the book is fascinating and he's done such incredible research. I mean, it's always fun to have people who also love archives and love the research process, and then when you don't always agree on an argument, try to work it out in a friendly way.
Yeah, and that clearly comes out in your book. I mean, just a quick look at the endnotes and your bibliography shows quite a bit of archival work. So that's obviously another strength of this book. If I could add here, is that it's based on a lot of primary sources, really, and I think that is clearly shown in the book. And I really thank you for bringing that in your work as well. So if I could maybe just continue the conversation, because you've already indicated this. You write about Islamic legal revivalism. You just mentioned it in your answer to this previous question, and the return to Islam during this period. So can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so I think what we see in the 1930s, and it continues into the 1940s, are different segments of the Muslim community, both Islamic legal scholars, members of the ulema, but also lay people, engineers and doctors and lawyers, who are grappling with this idea that the European project and this project of citizenship and this project of minoritiness that has been emerging through the 20th century is actually not creating the space for Muslims to define and control their identity, their communities, and not giving a voice. And that there's a lot of promises that are made that are then stripped back. And this goes back to what I hate saying reptilian, since I don't know what their actual name is, but what that, the early question we got in the beginning of this interview, they were saying, that there are promises, and there's supposed to be negotiations and compromises, and Muslims continuously find themselves on the losing end of that. And so there is a movement to try to reclaim religious and Islamic institutional spaces and use those to formulate a more powerful political identity that in some and community that in some ways sort of removes themselves from sort of the secularizing society around them. And again, we see something like this. There's this sort of conservative trend in all sorts of different parts of Europe in the 1930s. So, this is part of this global sort of questioning of what's happening, what is liberalism, what is secularism, and where do kind of other pre-existing cultures, I don't want to say, traditional cultures, because I think some of this is not traditional. It's very much a modern response to how one creates a mass movement. And so there's this return to Islam that happens. There are revivalist groups, they publish newspapers and journals, they have organizations, they are trying to get especially Muslim youths to think about what it means to be a Muslim youth in this society and to sort of the return to Islam, to come back to a community and not allow for sort of a massive secularization of the Muslim community, which they see as leading to kind of its dilution and ultimate downfall.
Yeah, and so this sort of brings us to the post-World War II period. So with the communists coming to power in the former Yugoslavia, and especially in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina and probably even Kosovo and Northern Macedonia, there is a number of Muslim institutions that are simply abolished or they die out, and others survive, but they survive under a completely different set of rules that are set up by the new government. So maybe give us a little bit of that history with a couple of examples.
Yeah, so in 1946, the communists in Yugoslavia, they shutter most of the madrasas, they start to expropriate Waqf property, and they abolish Sharia law. This actually affects Muslims differently than other religious communities, because other religious communities continued to have like the sacrament or a way of performing religion. But with the abolishment of the Sharia courts, that is the main place where Muslims were able to sort of do the business, right, of religion. And so it really creates a challenge to kind of and upends the entire ways that Muslims had identified and structured their kind of social confessional community. From 1946 to 1949, we see dissidents. We see dissident movements that fight against sort of the breakdown of Islamic institutions. We also have militias and guerrilla movements. I've written about this a little bit in the book and also elsewhere, how there's this sort of massive multi-sided anti-communist movements, of which there are Muslim militias and movements that are part of it that fight this process. And at the same time, the government imprisons and ultimately executes a number of prominent Islamic legal scholars. And I find this really kind of fascinating because they don't execute the same kind of number, for example, of there after 1948, there's this Tito-Stalin split. Right, they don't execute the same number of conformists or pro-Soviet people. They send them for rehabilitation. But in 1949, they execute the Islamic leaders, especially that had been part of a movement called an organization called Al-Hidayah. And and they imprison a lot of members of Mladi Muslimani, and which is the young Muslim group. And they really see this as a kind of countering. They're nervous. They see the young Muslims and the Islamic groups as a threat to the formation of the socialist state in a way that they don't see all the other groups. And so we really have kind of an assault and an attack on Islam and on Muslim societies. And that's, in Kosovo, in North Macedonia, in Bosnia Herzegovina, in southern Serbia, in all of these places. And also in Zagreb. Zagreb is, the secret police in Zagreb is just vicious in the early 1950s. And the interrogation reports are really devastating.
You have a story of Munir Gavran Kapetanovic, and, he was arrested in Zagreb, right? So there's a lot of that. The question from Ismail is about, said any details on that upcoming panel in Chicago, asking as a local. So I guess he would like to attend, if you could maybe just.
Yeah, so the Association for Slavic East European Studies Conference, ACES, is going to be held in November, the second week of November in Chicago. And there'll be a number of talks and panels this year actually about Muslims in Eastern Europe. And it's I think I saw there's going to be 4 or 5 different ones that look really interesting. So I'll be speaking on 2 of them. And there's a whole, what's wonderful about this moment in scholarship is that, my book is part of kind of a new trend. There's been a number of really incredible books that have come out over the last 5 years that are really trying to write Muslims back into European history in different ways. And we take different methods and different approaches. They're all based on really deep archival work. There's Stefanos Katsikas, who wrote a book on Muslims in Greece, Milena Methodovia, who wrote about reformists in Bulgaria, and Fabio Giomi's book that was mentioned earlier. So we're kind of in this exciting moment, and there's many others who's I'm not going to give all the names, but it's a vibrant period, and I think we're going to see a shift here in the ways that we've seen shifts for other minorities to be written back into history in other places,
including Muslims in the region who are writing about these things in local languages as well. So there is a lot of that, and some of them write in English too, and other languages, but there's a lot of scholarship going on, which is really exciting.
Thank you for bringing that up, because it's something that I really try. Sorry, my phone suddenly is ringing, and it never rings. But yeah, there's a number of really great regional scholars who write both in English and not in English who are publishing, and it's and I think one of the goals that we have with more dominant language like English is to try to bring some of those voices into our conversations and have real dialogues.
Absolutely. Very good. So I would like to bring up my sort of final question, but we also have a couple of questions from the audience. So my final question is, how does your book and your project and this story that you're telling in the book, how does it fit within the making of modern Europe? Mm-hmm. What is the relevance of the Muslim experience in Southeastern Europe for the rest of the continent? And this also, I think, jives well with Esra's question on chat when she's asking, do you think that Muslims in the Balkans are an example of Muslims in Europe? So it's kind of very similar question. So how does this story fit within the making of modern Europe, and how is this experience relevant?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, first of all, the Balkans are Europe, right? And the Ottoman Empire is Europe. And I think partly what I'm trying to do here is sort of be part of a movement to rewrite the Ottoman Empire back into European history and think about what that means then for the ways we understand Europe. But in a more contemporary sense, I mean, I think what we're seeing are a lot of the debates that exist today, which are highly politicized, about the nature of European secularism, about Muslim identity and culture, debates over the hijab or Islam in school, debates over swimming pools and beaches, and also a lot of sort of the foundational roots of Islamophobia are not new. These are things that have existed for 200 years, since the 19th century and even earlier, although the earlier period had a lot more expulsion. There weren't necessarily efforts to integrate. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, as we start to piece together the history of Europe and make sense of, what this means today, having these examples from the past helps us to kind of think a little bit about our own presumptions and also sort of challenge some of the core ideas of what is European secularism. I mean, why did it take so long in France, right, for Muslims to have all the same citizenship rights when that existed half a century earlier in other places? And how do we understand, debates over building a mosque in Bulgaria with debates over building a mosque today in Austria? And I think putting these things together helps us see that these are not new debates, that Muslims have been depicted as foreign and outsiders, especially in moments of crisis, that they're kind of a convenient scapegoat. And it's a problem, and we need to sort of fix it. And as a scholar, I think I'm trying to do my little part in contributing to the conversation that helps perhaps correct our understandings of Europe's past in a way that will then speak to Europe's future.
Yes, and thank you for that question. And one final question from the audience, which is not really under the scope of the book, and it's a tough one. And it says, what insights from the book do you think can help address the current crisis in post-Dayton Bosnia and make sense of their origins? Now that's a tough one.
And I ended the book in 1949 for a reason.
True.
You know, I think that one of the ways we need to I mean, I really struggle with post-Dayton Bosnia. I love Bosnia. I have a lot of very close connections there. It's where I first lived to do long research. I mean, I spent a year living in Sarajevo and in 2004. And I think what the book asks us to kind of make sense of is, well, how do we sort of start this conversation differently, right? Can we start conversations from a place of there's sort of shared history, there's been this complex set of nation building, there's been a lot of promises made and withdrawn. Muslims are here. This is part, they are indigenous to this region. They belong here and they're part of the historic past. And so are Serbs and Croats, right? And so looking, I hope, at some of the ways that it worked and also the ways that these negotiations didn't, and the kinds of movements that emerged from that, might provide some insight. But that's really a question for political scientists and policymakers. And I mean, it's it's a big question.
It's a big question, yeah. But I think it also leaves our audience craving for more, and maybe giving them ideas how they can contribute to this conversation as well. So with that being said, I think this has been wonderful, rich conversation. I would like to thank our audience for listening to us, for sticking with us in spite of some of the technological glitches that we've experienced, and obviously
Yes.
to Professor Emily Greble for doing this fascinating conversation with us, and for writing this wonderful, wonderful book that I hope everybody is going to go out and buy and read. So with that being said, Professor Greble, once again, thank you so much. This was
Thank you for having me, and thank you to all of you who stuck with our weird technical difficulties.
Yeah, well, things happen. I mean, who would have thought that we're going to have power outage in Atlanta for a few minutes, or at least here in the hotel. I don't know if it's the whole Atlanta or the area, but at least we didn't have it in our room.
No, I mean, things happen. So
things happen, yeah. But we kept the conversation going, and that's the most important.
I almost told the story of my 8-year-old presenting to his class about how he had to walk across the border from Serbia to Bosnia when we were denied entry. That was going to be my other my other pause if you didn't come back.
Good. Well, with that story and with that thought, we're going to end our conversation here. Once again, thanks everybody. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. And for anyone who couldn't join us immediately, they can always watch this on YouTube. It's going to be on our channel. Once again, my name is Ermin Sinanovic. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University. And I thank you all, and I wish you all a wonderful day and the rest of your summer.